Well, good evening, friends, and welcome to this evening's meeting at the London ULT. Tonight we have a panel discussion consisting of two short talks and followed by about an hour of questions and answers. And the subject is living consciously, dying peacefully. Everything is a matter of consciousness, and death, in inverted commas, is merely the other side of ever-present life. So this is a very practical subject, because sooner or later all of us one day will face our impending death. And indeed, it's often said that life consists of preparation for the states of consciousness and being that come after death. Because if you accept the idea of the immortality of the soul, the real being, the reincarnating entity, then death is really just another chapter in the long history of that pilgrimage. So as we go through our everyday life, we are building a consistency and a view that we carry forward for many lives, not just the after-death states, but we are, or we can, consciously program our future incarnations. So it's wonderfully practical. It needs a thorough understanding of the law of karma, the process of reincarnation, of cyclic rebirths, which is one of the mechanisms that karma uses. So we've got a lot of interesting ground to cover this evening. So the format will be two short talks, and then the two speakers will remain on the platform, and there'll be the panel, and just ask your questions to them and open up the discussion. We'll involve our friends on Skype either by, you can, if you're on Skype, you can either type in your questions into the text box and we'll read them out, or do butt in at an appropriate moment. And if everyone's talking, then just butt in anyway. We've put the devotional reading in the text box. Hope you can see it. And it's taken from the Dhammapada, which many of you will know. It's the sayings of the Buddha, recorded by his disciples or arhats after his passing. The Buddha, like Christ, never actually put pen to paper, as far as I know. But all his sayings were recorded. So tonight we're going to read chapter 4, and the title is Flowers. Flowers. Who shall overcome this earth? And who the sphere of Yama, the god of death? And who the world of the happy gods? And who shall choose the steps on the path of law, even as the gardener culls or plucks the choicest blooms? The disciple will overcome this earth, and also Yamaloka, also the sphere of the gods. the disciple chooses to take steps on the path of Lord, he is the expert gardener who culls the choicest blooms. Knowing that this body is like froth, knowing that its nature is that of a mirage, and breaking the flowery shafts of Mara, illusion, the disciple passes untouched by death. Death bears off the man whose mind is intent on plucking the flowers of sense, as a flood sweeps away a sleeping hamlet. We'll reread the last. So I'm sorry about the interruption. We'll read the last verse that we got up to. Death bears off the man whose mind is intent on plucking the flowers of sense. Whose mind is intent on plucking the flowers of sense. As a flood sweeps away a sleeping hamlet. Death overpowers the man who is gathering the flowers of sense, even before he has satiated in his pleasure. The bee gathers honey without injuring the scent or the colour of the flower. So should the silent one, the Muni, live his life. Not the unworthy actions of others, nor their sins of commission and omission, but his own acts of omission and commission should one regard. Like a flower full of colour, but without fragrance, are the fair words which bear no fruit in action. Like a beautiful flower full of colour and fragrance are the fair words whose fruits are deeds or actions. Many kinds of garlands can be made from a heap of flowers. Many good works can be gathered by a mortal once he is born. The scent of flowers travels not against the wind, be it Tagara or Malika or even the sandalwood tree. But the fragrance of the good wafts even against the wind. The fragrance of the good man pervades all his ways. The fragrance of virtue is unsurpassed among the perfumes of sandalwood, of lotus, of Tagara, of Vasiki, which is jasmine. Faint is the scent of Tagara or sandalwood. The fragrance of the virtuous ascends to the heights of the gods. Mara, or illusion, Mara is the tempter. Mara is the temptation. Mara never finds the way to those who possess real virtue, who are vigilant, who are freed by perfect knowledge. Mara never finds the way to those. From a heap of rubbish on the roadside, a lily blooms, fragrant and pleasing. From a mass of blinded mortals arises the disciple of the truly wise one, shining with exceeding glory of his own wisdom.
What does it mean to live life consciously? It's probably something that we all would like to do, but it's also probably something that most, if not all of us, do not yet do, or at least only do to a relatively small degree. And why is that? Mainly because it takes effort. The reason it takes effort is because we've spent so many years and so much time doing the exact opposite. Today's way of living and the rhythm and focuses of modern life tend to lead people into a very unconscious state of being. But imagine what it would be like to be fully conscious of and in everything that you do, every thought that you think, every feeling that you have, and every word that you speak, and to do all of that from a higher, more perceptive, more transcendent, and much purer state of consciousness than you currently do. In order to be able to live consciously, one has to adopt a higher mental position, a higher sense of self-identity. One has to endeavour to always look upon the body and the whole personal self as not the real self, but merely as an instrument and vehicle, a karmically produced vehicle in and through which the real you lives and operates and functions when awake on this plane. There's no escaping the fact that our karma, our own self-created destiny, has put us in this body, in this personality, here and now, as the inevitable consequence, effect, and reaction to our thoughts, feelings, words, and actions in a previous lifetime. But we can take control and decide that our daily watchwords will be three: self-discipline, self-denial, spiritual self-mastery. We do not have to be victim to our own creation, this admittedly imperfect personal self. We can master it and use it consciously to be and do good in this world. Since everything proceeds from within, without, we have to look within. It may aid us to learn by heart the definition that H.P. Blavatsky gives of Raja Yoga in the Theosophical Glossary. And this was quoted and referred to in one of the talks yesterday at the seminar we had. She says of Raja Yoga that it is the conscious exercise, regulation, and concentration of thought. The conscious exercise of thought, the conscious regulation of thought, and the conscious concentration of thought. And obviously this has to be a perpetual practice in order to produce perpetual results. It should ideally take place every moment, expressing itself in the conscious and meditative living of life. This is living life consciously and harmlessly, and living at the highest point of consciousness possible, every moment possible. HPB writes, "Be hopeful then, not despairing. With each morning's awakening, try to live through the day in harmony with the higher self. Try is the battle cry taught by the teacher to each pupil. Naught else is expected of you. One who does his best does all that can be asked. There is a moment when even a Buddha ceases to be a sinning mortal and takes his first step toward Buddhahood." Let's look briefly at those three facets of HPB's definition of Raja Yoga. The conscious exercise of thought means that we have to learn to think. We have to exercise our minds. We have to put aside all mental laziness, and we have to go beyond the untheosophical idea that thought is bad or that mind is an obstacle, and make use of this divinely gifted and sacred faculty of thought, which is literally a gift of the gods, as Theosophy teaches us. If our aim is to live consciously, then we can exercise our thought in matters of high spiritual philosophy and esotericism or metaphysics. HPB is quoted as saying, "See in study of the secret doctrine a means of exercising and developing the mind never touched by other studies. Theosophy is for those who can think," she said, or for those who can drive themselves to think, not mental sluggards. This is something very important and which shouldn't be minimized, but by itself it isn't enough. It's only 1/3 of the Raja Yogic Trinity. The conscious exercise of thought, and then the conscious regulation of thought. This includes the continual purification and elevation of the mind. That is, never allowing one's thoughts to descend to the sensual, passionate, or animalistic level, but keeping the mind constantly and consciously focused on the higher, the pure, the clean, and the holy. This is staying ever established in sattva guna, as Krishna advises Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita. To regulate one's thought is to order and control it. Jesus said that if a man looks lustfully at a woman, he has already, by that very act of lustful thought and imagination, he has already committed adultery with her. That's how karmically serious this is. And of course it also applies for women looking at or thinking about men. This is all considered normal, natural and unavoidable behaviour in today's world, but this is not what the ancient wisdom teaches. It's very serious about these things and about treading the path of purity. And then, the conscious concentration of thought relates to the fact that most of us do many things without concentrating on them at all, and in fact pass much of our lives in a sort of half-dazed state without even knowing it. The aim of cultivating concentration is to get the individual fully attentive, conscious, and aware of their surroundings, activities, and actions. When we become aware that we've just been doing something in a non-concentrated state of mind, we then make the attempt to concentrate and to carry on like that. To continually and really practice this conscious exercise, regulation, and concentration of the mind, from when we wake up in the morning to when we fall asleep at night, is not easy. We have to expect to encounter difficulties with it so that we don't become too frustrated or despondent. Even a little sincere effort and intention and exercise in this regard every day will bear valuable fruit, and practice makes perfect. The fact that others, such as those we speak of as the masters of wisdom, the fact that they have done all this is the proof that we can do all this if we truly want to. We are the only one who stands in our own way. Sooner or later we have to get out of our own way and move onwards and upwards in order to go with the evolutionary flow. Now, 5 brief points for consideration which may be helpful. Number 1, every moment counts. There is never a split second of time when we are not both experiencing and creating karma. We are setting causes in motion every moment with our every thought, feeling, word and deed. In the past, we created our present. In the present, we are creating our future, whether we realize it or not, and our life and future is inextricably bound up with that of the whole human family. We are thus extremely, severely, awfully responsible beings, and we have to be willing to take that responsibility and live accordingly. And second, most of us know about the paramitas, or golden virtues, which form the basis of living the higher life. All are important, but let us never lose sight of the second, called Shila. This perfect harmony in word and act means living a life in which the words we say accurately reflect and represent everything that we do, and in which all that we do is exactly in line and harmony with all that we say. There is thus no place for hypocrisy or deception. There can only be perfect honesty, truth, and integrity. At this stage in our lives and inner journey, we should not, under any circumstances, be saying or doing, whether publicly or privately, anything which we would be ashamed for anyone else to know about. Shila is defined by some as moral discipline. Number 3. William Judge says that HPB once gave him this valuable advice in a letter: be more charitable for others than for yourself, and more severe on yourself than on others. Mr. Judge added in his own words, if you find friction between yourself and another or others, never stop to think where they are wrong. Everybody is always wrong somewhere, and apart from that, it would be easy enough to find their errors in your own imagination. Their errors, real or imaginary, are no concern of yours, are not your duty, and need not and should not be considered by you. For you to do so would be to make an occult break. What concerns you, and what is your duty, is to discover wherein you have been at fault. If, on finding friction of any sort, you will look back over your past thoughts and words and deeds, you will surely find you have erred, either directly or indirectly, by leaving something undone or unsaid. By living that way, you will learn a good deal about yourself, while by looking for and noting the possible faults of others, no matter how greatly they have sinned, in your opinion, you will learn nothing and will merely prove yourself an ass, he said. Number 4. Remember what the 4th paramita is. Being the 4th of the 7th means that it's the central one. Called vairagya in Sanskrit, it is dispassion, detachment, desirelessness, indifference to one's own so-called pleasure and so-called pain. We read in the voice of the silence that stern and exacting is the virtue of vairagya. And again, Mara's, and we heard about Mara in the reading, Mara's arrows ever smite the man who has not reached vairagya. And number 5, remember the daily initiation. Mr. Judge writes that testing experiences and opportunities arise each day in the life of the serious student and dedicated aspirant to the esoteric wisdom. We must be prepared for these daily initiations and to recognize them when they come, and to ensure that we pass through them successfully and triumphantly. We felt that the following words from Robert Crosby summed up very nicely all that we've been trying to put across in these few minutes. He said, how shall we apply theosophy in daily life? First, to think what we are in reality on arising, to endeavour to realize what this small segment of our great existence may mean in the long series of such existences, to resolve to live throughout the day from the highest of our realizations, to see in each event and circumstance a reproduction in small or in great of that which has been, and to deal with each and every one of these from that same high point, resolve to deal with them as though each had a deep, occult meaning and presented an opportunity to further the successes of the past or undo the errors. Thus living from moment to moment, hour to hour, life will be seen as a portion of a great web of action and reaction, intermeshed at every point, and connected with the soul which provided the energy that sustained it. If each event is so considered throughout the day, be it small or great, the power to guide and control your energies will in no long time be yours. The smaller cycles of the personal ego will be related to the divine ego, and the force that flows from the latter will show itself in every way, will strengthen the whole nature, and will even change the conditions, physical and otherwise, which surround you. And now from living consciously, we'll move on to its natural result, dying peacefully.
Indeed, a knowledge of the after-death states, of reincarnation, the immortality of the soul, all of these combined with maybe the testimony of those who had near-death experiences, for example, all this can provide an antidote to the fear of death. We're told by HBB in the Key to Theosophy that death comes to our spiritual selves ever as a deliverer and friend. And when we think about it, this fear of death is based in the lower self or the personality, and can be a mixture of fear of the unknown and of attachment or identification to the transitory body and personality. And therefore, a knowledge of our real immortal nature combined to a knowledge of the after-death states, of the law of cycles, reincarnation as applied to man, can help. So we'll now have a closer look at the different aspects of the dying process and death, what we call death. Theosophy teaches that at the moment of death, there is what is called a life review. So the whole life of the individual is seen in front of his eyes in the minutest details. At an instant, the personal, HBB writes, becomes one with the individual, an all-knowing ego, and it sees in front of it the whole chain of cause and effect at work in its life, sees itself as it was honestly, without flattery or self-deception, and understands the justice of all the suffering it has experienced. And really, this is a realization of karma's justice. The law of karma is absolute mercy and justice. And it should be said that for more advanced being on the path, they not only just see the previous life that has just gone, but they also see the chain of causes involving previous lives as well. And the implication for those who might find themselves at someone's deathbed, some implication and advice are given by one of the masters. He says, "Speak in whispers, ye who assist at a deathbed, and find yourselves in the solemn presence of death. Especially have you to keep quiet just after death has laid her clammy hand upon the body. Speak in whispers, I say, lest you disturb the quiet ripple of thought and hinder the busy work of the past, casting on its reflection upon the veil of the future. So at the time of death, after this review, the three lower principles, which are the physical body, the astral body, which is the electromagnetic template on which the physical body is built, and prana, or the life energy, the energy that is coherent and that holds the body together. These three principles separate from the rest, from the other four principles. And these lower three will then slowly decompose and be recycled in nature. Now, what happens to the remaining four principles is so that next stage is called Kamaloka, and comprises of Kama, or the animal soul, which is the sort of passions and desires, together with Manas, or the mind, or the human soul, together with Buddhi, which is the spiritual soul, the spiritual intuition, cognition, and Atma, the spirit, the universal spirit, the one self, the higher self. These four enter into the Kamaloka, which is itself a process of separation of the lower desires and experiences from the higher, nobler, and more spiritual aspirations. And we can understand it's like a process of decantation, where you have a mixture of things that are more subtle and mixed with things that are more dense. If they're shaken around, they'll be mixed. And if you let them settle, there'll be a gradual separation, and the densest will fall at the bottom, and the more subtle will remain at the top. That's a little bit of an analogy to understand this, what happens at this stage. So the reason why this happens is because the lower, more terrestrial desires and experiences cannot be taken by the soul in the next stage, which is Devachan, which is a stage of spiritual, which happens on the spiritual plane. So these lower terrestrial experiences and desires will have to be separated first. And these higher experiences and aspirations will be taken with the soul in the next stage, Devachan, and be assimilated into the permanent ego. So, in that state of Kamaloka, most men go through it in an unconscious state. In the rare exception, we're told, of the very materialistic and unspiritual personalities, the Theosophy also gives a very strong warning not to disturb this process that happens in Kamaloka by trying to contact the entity after death, either through mediums and seances or necromancy, etc. Because it's by doing so you disturb the process, and you also give energies to these entities, and you slow down their evolution. So what happens at the end of this separation, we now have a separation from the lower terrestrial desires and passions and experiences, which then form the Kamarupa, or shell. together with some aspects from the lower manas, because the mind or manas is dual in nature, and there again we have a separation of the mind principle, and there's a separation between the higher aspirations from the lower, which correspond to which are in relation with the kamic principle. And so at the end of this separation, we have what is called the second death, and the top three principles, Atma, Buddhi and Manas, or the spirit, the spiritual soul and the human soul, which are really three aspects of the one reality, the real man, the triad, enter into Devachan. So what is Devachan? Well, Devachan is a state of subjective bliss, a dreamlike, we can say, but more vivid. It is the idealized continuation of the life just left, the product of the spiritual aspirations unsatisfied in the life. It is created by ourselves, hence it's a bit subjective, based on the beliefs we held in life. And so, for example, the Christian will have an imaginary Christian paradise. The Muslim will have an imaginary Muslim paradise, and so on and so forth. So it's based on the beliefs and the aspirations of the previous life. We should say it's not a place, as in a location, but it's more a state of consciousness. And it's a state where we are in communion with the loved ones, both the ones that are still alive and the ones that have departed. And we see these loved ones as happy and idealized. So in the Devachanic state, we don't see their defects and or all their negative qualities that might. We don't see the suffering, because it's a state of bliss. If you imagine, if you actually saw people that you loved suffer, you wouldn't be able to be happy. You would suffer with them. You'd feel their suffering. So that's why it's a state of a subjective state, a product of, we could say, our imagination. And it's a reward, in a way, for all the unrealized aspirations that we've had, spiritual aspiration, higher, nobler aspirations that we had in the previous life. So we could say that all the good deeds and words and thoughts in the previous lives are the basis of this Devachanic experience, whereas the negative or bad deeds, words and thoughts will have to wait for man to finish his Devachan, and he'll have to deal with these in the next incarnation, because they're his karma. And there'll be the karmic consequences which he will meet, which are really opportunities to learn and correct, readjust. We should say that in terms of duration, the length of the Devachan is proportional to the amount of spiritual aspiration and energy from that life, and so that varies a lot between individuals. But it is a state of illusion, or mayavic, I should say, because, as we said earlier, it is disconnected from the suffering of earthly life which other beings go through. In some way, quite similar to that of nirvana, which is the state of bliss, which is the reward from the liberation process that Buddhas go through. And this nirvanic state, which is the goal or the reward of this liberation process, can either be accepted by the Buddha, in which case he becomes a Pratyeka Buddha and enjoys this reward, this nirvanic bliss, but again he's then separated for a very long period of time from the reality and the suffering of other men on earth. The other option is that of the Bodhisattva, who deliberately renounces this nirvanic bliss in order to stay behind and stay in touch with suffering humanity. And you could imagine that by analogy, at a certain stage of our evolution, we might, in preparation for the renouncing of nirvana, one might want to shorten this devachanic state, potentially. That's an idea. So, when all this energy that has fueled these aspirations and that formed the basis on which Devachan was built, when all these energy run out, then the ego is attracted back to earth into a new incarnation, guided by his karma. And before the soul then incarnates in a new body, we're told that it goes through a prospective vision before that incarnation, where the soul sees the life it has in front of him and realizes the chain of cause and effect that has led it to this life and to the circumstances which it will have to live through. So there is a certain symmetry with the panoramic vision at the end of the previous life, before the Devachanic experience, and the retrospective insight that is given prior to the next life. And this is really important because it means that inside us we know, a part of us knows the absolute justice of all the things that we're going through. It might just be that our waking consciousness is not aware and we don't remember, but part of us knows, and that part of us that knows can help us through dreams and maybe through the practice of meditation and through what we've heard essentially in the first talk. So I think we should probably conclude this talk on death now and invite our other speaker to come on the platform and answer any questions you might have.
Yes, I mean, we understand, of course, we must live consciously, but should we not also endeavour to die consciously and pass through all of these stages after death consciously, as the soul does when it returns from Devachan and then is reborn? So, in other words, isn't the ideal to remain conscious in all these different states of being, even through the actual change from one to the other? Is that not the way the adept, because we know the adept is conscious on all planes. Should we not aspire to the same?
It seems to us that the adepts don't go through Devachan because they've sort of gone beyond the necessity for having Devachan, because they've actually achieved this immortality, which is a continuity in consciousness through all the different levels of consciousness.
Well, 2 points I would say on that. One is, would we really want to consciously go through Kamaloka? Because remember, it's the second death that's being experienced, the separation or breaking apart of the Kama manasic nature and the higher manasic nature. It is literally a second death. It's described by T. Sabarao as astral death in comparison with the physical death that happens on earth. And just as bodily death causes such a shock to the soul that it's rendered unconscious and is in a dazed, generally unconscious state in Kamaloka, so it's said that the second death is a further shock, and the soul then enters an even more deeply, profoundly unconscious state known as the gestation period before entering Devachan. So it's quite a serious and dramatic process that might cause a lot of suffering if it was to be gone through consciously. And the other point is that the masters said that the only ones who remain conscious at and through death and who know that they have died are either adepts of the right-hand path or the left-hand path. So either a good adept or master or a black magician. They are the ones who've developed their consciousness to the point of remaining conscious all the way through. And they obviously, as was just said, don't go through the regular process that others would. Robin?
Well, one of the most interesting books, now it's Professor Moody, isn't it? We're back against death.
Moody.
Have you heard of Professor Moody?
Yes.
Any comment to make on it?
Professor Raymond Moody investigated the near-death experiences, and he found some common patterns, and he sort of schematically he's found that so when either in accidents or say in operations, people undergoing surgery, when they've gone through clinical death but have managed to come back, they all have a very similar story to tell. And they say that they see a separation and they see themselves exiting the body, and they see their body from above. They can still hear or they know what people in the room are thinking. And then what happens is they see a tunnel, they see a light, a warm light that seems very welcoming, and they go through, they're attracted to that light, and they sometimes are greeted by some loved ones in that light, and then they sort of feel a really comforting, warm feeling, and that light gets sort of warmer and more intense, and then they come back, and the stories differs then according to the individuals. Sometimes they come back out of choice; they're given the choice. Sometimes they're told you have a unfinished business, so you have to come back to life, and so that this varies according to the individual. But then they end up coming back and telling this story. And sorry, I forgot the. They mention also before seeing the light and after going above their own body, they see this this vision, this panoramic vision, where they see all their all the actions of their lives in front of them. But as was said, it's not just the acts as they were, as they lived when they lived that life, as if you were to see a film of your life. but they actually understand the cause and effect, and they also, when the actions were in relation to other individuals, they actually feel how the other person perceived their actions. So, for example, if they hurt someone, they feel the pain that the other person felt. And that's essentially very similar to what Theosophy teaches.
Is there anything that you wanted to...
No, that's a good answer. It's just that his work was one of the most valuable in terms of all the books I've consulted, bringing about what we haven't.
Yeah, life after life, I think.
Yes.
Well, you made the reference to the fact that those people often have the sensation of being above the body, looking down at not only the body, but what's going on around it in those experiences. And in that passage from the Key to Theosophy that was quoted from in the second talk, where it talks about the review of everything that happened in the life that's ending, HPB adds, he reads his life remaining as a spectator, looking down into the arena he is quitting. And what that exactly is intended to mean, we don't know, but that is taken by a student of Theosophy in Paris who's written a number of books about near-death experiences. That's taken by him to be referring to this same type of experience that was just mentioned.
Can consciousness ever be lost?
Can consciousness ever be lost?
Self-consciousness can, but pure consciousness itself cannot, because it's the only reality.
Then if it cannot be lost, then why do we have to be conscious?
We don't have to.
Could you repeat the questions?
The first question was, can consciousness ever be lost? And then did you say, if not, why do we have to be conscious?
To be conscious is in a contradiction if consciousness is not lost.
Well, the being side of it, as I understand, is being self-conscious. To the less self-conscious we are, the more unconscious, you could say, we are in what we do. Even if we're physically awake, if we're not self-conscious of what we're doing or our surroundings or our thoughts, we're living in a sort of unconscious manner. I don't know if that relates to...
But isn't the involvement of being self-conscious deprive you of being conscious? Because you're more motivated from this small self to be conscious. But isn't to be conscious and let the consciousness live through, rather than trying to be someone who's conscious? You know what I mean?
I understand what you mean. Yeah.
Well, it may help to perhaps define what we mean by conscious, by being conscious, and by being self-conscious. Now, my understanding, and it may not be quite correct, is that a synonym for consciousness is like perception. So animals have consciousness, they have perception. They don't have very highly developed self-consciousness. They're more focused on the outside world. They don't have self-reflective or self-analytical consciousness. So we have to have both, really. We have to have good perception of what's going on around us, be sensitive to other people's feelings. Like Will said, you have this amazing perception of, in this post-death life review, of how you made other people think. I mean, that's a form of consciousness. So we need good consciousness, but we also need the self-consciousness, it seems. I mean, that's just an idea.
And another idea is when we say losing consciousness, it's not an interruption, it's not that consciousness disappears, it's a change in state of consciousness. So in that sense, or if we take the sleep states, for example, the states we go through sleep, what happens is we change state of consciousness, we go deeper from the waking state, we then gradually move on to the dream state, and then eventually end up in the dreamless state, and then have to come back to the waking state. So we sort of change state of consciousness, but we don't actually lose. I mean, maybe from a perceiver who might stand there, it might appear to that other person that you lose consciousness because you fall asleep and you're not there. But actually, you don't lose consciousness, you just change state of consciousness.
In regard to theosophical teaching about the human constitution, what's listed on the chart or the board as the fifth principle, the higher manas, is described as being individual self-consciousness. It is a self-conscious individuality, which is the human soul, the reincarnating part of us. So when we say self-conscious, we're not necessarily referring to the lower self or personal egoism. The HPB makes the distinction between the lower manas having egoism or selfishness, and the higher manas being egoity or selfhood. So that is the inner I. And although pure consciousness itself is above and beyond that, which is Atma, listed on there, still we're in this world and in this cycle of incarnations as a self-conscious individuality, which is divine and of a higher nature than the physical and the personal. And our duty is to live as much as we can as that individual self-consciousness, as a way of individualizing universality, even though that may sound paradoxical. The voice of the silence says, rather than, as some people think, the aim being for the drop to merge back into the ocean, it says the drop has to merge in the ocean and the ocean has to merge in the drop. We have to do that and live as that.
Yeah, actually, our higher manas is always connected with the other higher principles. But the issue is, in our daily consciousness, our personality is not connected, or at least not constantly. Only occasionally, if we practice, say, meditation, or if we have this conscious sort of exercise of aiming towards the higher aspects, we open up that channel between the higher and the lower, and then we're able to reflect in our more and more as we do it in our personality the higher aspects and the higher so the idea is to gradually become more and more able to have this consciousness of the universality of life, the unity of life in our waking consciousness, but that can only happen if we've sort of cleared that channel and removed all the obstacles, a lot of which have been touched on yesterday in the seminar.
Shall I go to Chris's?
Yeah, if an atheist or an agnostic has no concept of a heaven or hell, do they experience devachan?
Yeah, so the question was, an atheist, for example, or an agnostic, if they have no conception of heaven or hell, can they experience devachan? And I think the answer is given very clearly by HPB in the key, and she says no. That's essentially, you need to have imagined imagine that an after state to be able to live it, because it's based on this this aspiration that and the beliefs held during the life, as I understand it.
Would it be not to live consciously in it, or to gain some the rest, the positive aspect of that state, that state which is Devakan confers to, is that it gives assimilation, rest, and a kind of peace and regeneration for the new incarnation. So a person who doesn't, in the article states after death, when it's said that a person who is a materialist or who doesn't believe in all these after death states, he goes through these states because this is what the ideas and the energy that have been generated in the incarnating life bring the person to go through these states after death. But he'll go through it without being conscious of it. But he will have a time of Devakan, but he will not benefit by it as somebody who's really living it in that state of bliss. So there may be a little bit of, I would say an explanation in that kind of situation. It's like a person living through between two stations, she says, in a state of sleep. So he doesn't really look at the landscape, he doesn't enjoy something, whereas a person who's had this consciousness will really make the best of the period of their life.
Thanks for this contribution. Do you want to add some?
Yes, well, in the key to Theosophy, she goes on to say, in order to live a conscious life in the sense of being conscious in Devachan, of one's heavenly or blissful surroundings, one has to believe, first of all, in that life during the terrestrial existence. According to the afterlife a man has believed in and expected, such is the life he will have. He who expected no life to come will have an absolute blank, amounting to annihilation. So it's not literal annihilation, but it seems like that in the interval between the two rebirths. And also in the same book, when the Enquirer says that surely after death the spiritual eyes of the atheist or materialist will be opened, and after death he will see the reality of spiritual existence, she responded, he will not be compelled, nor will he see anything. Having persistently denied during life the continuance of existence after death, he will be unable to see it, because his spiritual capacity, having been stunted in life, it cannot develop after death, and he will remain blind. And in the opening words, just before the devotional reading, there was a reference to programming one's own life or lives. So whether we do that consciously and deliberately, taking conscious control of our thoughts and our destiny, or not, we are still programming our experiences, both in life and after death. This is what this hints at. You had your...
Well, I'll read out there's a comment from Steve on Skype. Thinking the dying process over, or thinking through the dying process, and the question which Matthew rhetorically asked, would one want to witness the process of Kamaloka? It makes one wonder, if one did experience this as a rather helpless spectator, then one would have no way to respond or assimilate what one may see. So this is if you witness the process of Kamaloka. This might seem similar to HPB's concern in the suffering possibly caused regarding where spiritualism wants to acknowledge how a dead mother is able to see what is happening to the family, where HPB says love may be felt. Something may be said about this love. Might something be said about this love, which can be felt even after death by the members of the family, by the mother, for the members of the family. And can it have any effect upon the newly dead? So there's two questions in there. Might something be said about this love? This is of the dead mother for her family, which can be felt even after death.
I didn't understand the bit where it said, can this be felt by the newly dead?
Can this have any effect upon the newly dead? Well, answer the first one, which is the mother's love for the existing family who are alive.
So during Devachan, the loving mother cannot be aware, cannot be conscious of, and not be in contact with her children left behind in the life, because if it was the case, she would see them suffering, and she would suffer herself, and it wouldn't be bliss. So there is a protection in a way, and what happens is she, in that state of Devachan, she imagines herself with her loved ones, and they're doing well and they're very happy, and she loves them very much, and they love each other very much and that love, that deep, intense love that she feels for her children, can still be felt by her children, and it is said can actually, in the cases of very strong selfless love, as in the case of a mother for her children, it can act as a protection for the children, protection from harm that might happen in a way. And that is also something to be added about the fact that when we, for example, at night, if the children dream, they naturally raise their consciousness to that spiritual plane in which they can be in communion, because it's the same plane in which the mother is experiencing. So even though they're not consciously aware of one another, they still feel that communion. Whether they can remember it when they come back to the waking state is another thing. But
well, that can be what's behind. If one wakes up and remembers having had a dream in which they were pleasantly communicating with a loved one who has departed, that can be the filtering through the dreaming state into the waking consciousness of such an experience as you mentioned, which is probably experienced in the dreamless state.
So the second part of the question is, can it be felt by the person who just died, so by the mother?
No, I think it's more like if one of the loved children then died, would they feel that, I suppose, in Devachan?
Or does he mean, can the love be felt from the newly dead?
Would you like to clarify, Steve?
Yeah, I was kind of thinking, if this love can penetrate in such a way, could it remain effective regardless? But then I'm thinking that perhaps the process of being gone of the newly deceased person is so overwhelming that probably not.
So it's the love for a mother, and the son also dies. So what does he feel? He wouldn't feel anything in Kamaloka, presumably, but he might in the Devachan.
Well, as was said in the second talk about Devachan being a purely subjective state. It means that each individual has their own individual devachan, although they don't realize that that's the case. So if, for example, just to give an illustration, if there was a family of a father and mother, a son and a daughter, and if they were all to die at the same time, there would then be 4 different devachanic experiences going on, all slightly different, but each would be represented in each other's devachan in this illusory, dreamlike way. So it said there's no direct one-on-one conscious communication, because even the slightest interruption or interference, quote-unquote, with another's devachan is to intrude into that purely subjective bliss. So that can't happen. But maybe the love that the daughter feels for the devachanic representation of her mother may in some way be felt by the mother in her devachanic state from the illusory daughter. Maybe this might all sound complex, but if one reads the books and things that refer to this and thinks about it, it all becomes much simpler and makes a lot of sense.
But going back to the near-death experience, people often speak of a loving being who guides them, being a being of light, or possibly a loved one who appears, to help them. But this near-death experience seems to be a kind of initiation experience, because invariably all of these people who return to life, their lives are transformed. They become different people altogether. Their personalities are transformed. They very often become better human beings. They realize what their life's purpose is. They go in a different direction. They more enlightened.
They live more consciously.
Exactly. And so, it's obviously, it's not a karmalokic experience, because the second death doesn't come into it. But it's definitely an out-of-body experience. But the soul is still connected to the body by the silver thread, or the silver cord. And then there's a program on the radio this last week about this subject, and they were arguing, the pros and cons of it. And one was the pure, materialistic scientists or doctors were saying it's all hallucination, caused by the drugs they use and medication and so on. And the argument was it's a proof that the soul exists independently of the body. That the consciousness survives the death of the body.
So actually on that topic, Professor Moody sort of spoke about that, and he answered this question. So he said, although he said he's very careful, and he avoids drawing a conclusion that these experiences are any absolute proof of the survival of the soul after the body, or of the immortality of the soul. They might be suggestive of it, but he doesn't say they're absolute proofs. And he actually gave an example to counter the argument, the materialistic argument, that these might just be sort of biochemically induced experiences from brain chemistry and created by the brain. He said that there were examples that he witnessed of people who witnessed others have a near-death experience, but they also had an experience of that. So they, for example, they felt like they were also lifted from their own body at the same time as that other person dying, and saw that person leave towards that tunnel of light, and then came back. Now, that person who is witnessing that is not going through the same biochemical transformations in the brain as a dying person would. So he was saying that this strongly suggests that the materialistic argument that all this is the product of a brain would be
A
wrong.
hallucination.
That's right.
Could you provide the reference for that?
Uh,
where you read that in Professor Moody's work?
It was a talk he gave. It's available on YouTube. I can give the
Perhaps
reference.
you could circulate it later.
Yeah.
Because that's very interesting, actually. It's very. I mean, those arguments are very helpful and very scientifically speaking, they're very important because we should use logic and reason and deduction in order to try to work out which side of the argument holds water. That's very important.